You're listening to Brain Juicer Bites, and today I'm going to be talking to Tom Fishbourne. And the reason we're talking to Tom is Tom has one of the most fascinating career histories. He's worked in, proper corporations, big ones and small ones, has a kind of marketing and marketing, creativity, innovation background, and somehow has found himself as a inspirational conference speaker and cartoonist trying to show us the absurdities of business life in a way that might teach us new things. So, Tom, why don't you tell us how you ended up here?
Great. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, it's kind of a funny path, actually. I don't know if it's the typical route after business school to wind up being a cartoonist, but it happened to me. I guess it goes back for me, actually, being a kid and reading cartoons and enjoying cartoons and thinking someday I might want to be a cartoonist. And some way along the path, I let that drop. It's kind of a very difficult career. The two traditional paths of cartoonists are newspaper cartooning, which is a terrible street, and getting cartoons into the New Yorker, which is a extreme long shot. They get over 1,000 cartoons a week, and I've heard they have actually a flip pad of rejection slips so they can just instantly send out rejection notices to wannabe cartoonists. So for me, I let that completely drop and went into business instead. And I found it funny enough at business school. I started doodling on the backs of Harvard Business School cases, and people around me seemed to get a kick out of them. I put them in the school paper. People seemed to like them, and when I finished school, I just kept doing it and emailing cartoons to friends about observations of mine in the business world, and it seemed to spark a chord. And people started signing up for the list, and it's grown over time. 10 years later, my cartoons reach about 100,000 people a week, and it's completely through word of mouth. And I had no idea that it would take off the way that it did. But what I found along the way is that talking about business with cartoons is a really interesting medium, and cartoons actually also work really well as communication devices within business. So it ended up becoming a kind of a complementary skill set that I sort of fell into, and led ultimately to me believing a great job and becoming a full-time cartoonist in November.
So, what have you learned from cartooning? What's it taught you?
I guess there are a couple of things. If you talk to people about any sort of conventional category, you often have these rules of the category that you inherit. That you can do this or you can't do that. And in my case, cartooning kind of works that way. When I tell people now, I went to a party on Friday night and met one of my cartooning heroes, Berkeley Breathitt, who wrote Bloom County for so many years. I told him I was a cartoonist, and he looked at me like I had three heads, because he's like, how can anybody possibly be making a living at it? But the reason he says that is because he's thinking of it as the rules of traditional newspaper cartooning. And I think that in any category that you work in, there are conventions, and if you can go into look at those conventions with a little bit of refreshing naivete, you can often see things that haven't been seen before, and you can try something completely different. My brand experience included 5 years with Method, a startup cleaning products company started by two guys who'd never worked in consumer packaged goods before, and they wanted to launch a new cleaning brand, and people thought that was ludicrous because it's dominated by Procter and Gamble and Unilever. But Eric and Adam, the two founders, looked at the category entirely differently, and because they looked at the category entirely differently, they were able to take a shot at it and actually make something stick. And so I guess cartooning, that's the biggest lesson for me, that you can look at whatever business situation you're in and have a bit of naivete that lets you ultimately treat things differently. I guess the other big thing for me is the power of a niche audience. To write cartoons targeted to brand managers just couldn't have existed 10, 15 years ago. But nowadays, if you speak really in a very direct and impassioned way to a core loyal following, it's more powerful than talking in a bland way to the great majority. And I think a lot of brands can learn from that in talking to their core advocates and really being select and specific about who they talk to and who they reach, because the world has definitely shifted toward micro relationships and niche content.
Okay, so if you're really enjoying subverting and breaking the conventions of categories to, frankly make a good joke, What do you think businesses can learn from cartooning, or how do you think businesses should be using cartooning to help them do better business?
I think that there are a couple of ways. I think communication is a major area for business, both kind of within businesses, how they communicate to each other, and also how they communicate with their consumers. The whole media world has shifted dramatically. Don Draper is no longer in charge in terms of having a media message that's created that's created and then given to consumers in a command and control fashion. There's no longer a captive audience. So it's important for brands to think about how to communicate in a way that the communication itself has value, that it's not just an advertising message that's being pushed out there, but it's actually a conversation. And cartoons work very well with that. They break through the clutter. Well done cartoons are. I've heard one cartoonist describe them as the best involvement device ever created. People love reading cartoons. It's typically the most remembered part of a magazine. People read cartoons and they see themselves in the cartoon. So I found that I find that I've started to work with businesses in creating whole cartoon campaigns, not about their features and benefits, but about their consumer. And the consumers, they're open to receiving these messages and they like interacting with them, and it creates a true conversation. There's a shift in the TED Talks, which are so brilliant. Recently, they've started creating not just ideas worth sharing, but they created a new category called advertisements worth sharing. And I think that's a great description of any sort of advertising in this new media model. It has to be worth sharing, and I can't think of a better medium of sharing than cartoons.
Do you think cartoons work because they're so short? So you have to be able to kind of, get it in a glance? Is that
I
one of
think that's
the
part
reasons?
that that's part of it because we live in such a cluttered world, to break through that clutter is an increasing challenge. People are surrounded by more messages than ever, so cartoons convey an incredible amount of information in a small space. I think that's part of it, but I think the other part is that they just simply aren't seen as advertising if they're done well. I think any form of advertising communication, if it's treated as more of a conversation and less about pitching the features and benefits, is a step in the right direction. Cartoons are one example of a way to do this that's very concise and brief. People have obviously had success with YouTube videos doing the same thing. But the neat thing about cartoons is they're so quick and easy to do. You can create a high volume of them and put them out there as part of a continuous conversation, rather than try to bank on a couple of YouTube videos over the course of a year. Because I find that it's hard to predict what conversations will resonate with people and have the greatest likelihood to be shared. So if you can actually communicate through cartoons, every week over the course of a long period of time, not everyone will resonate, but you have a high likelihood of striking a chord at some point down the road. The continuity of communication is more important than any one piece of communication in particular.
You also talked about, how it's relatively easy. I'm sure they're quite hard to draw and to think up, but it's relatively easy to produce quite a volume of them. The paradox of success in most industries is you need quite a lot of failure to achieve it. So, what are the failures you remember in cartooning, or the messages you felt you couldn't get across?
It's the nice thing about cartooning nowadays versus historically is you can instantly track them. So when I send out every cartoon, I know within minutes how successful that cartoon will be through retweets and Facebook likes, and how many new subscribers I get, and how many people forward the cartoon around, and overall views and comments. It's an immediate feedback loop that is incredibly powerful. I think for any form of idea development, having that feedback loop is incredibly powerful. With cartoons, the nice thing about it is that if it didn't resonate, you have next week. Developing one cartoon is not as severe as an entire product launch. I guess the lesson for me on that is with product development, to prototype quickly. When I was at Method, we had a 3D printer that would print bottles overnight, and so you could come talk about an idea, and the next day you had a physical bottle in your hand that you could take out and show people and get immediate feedback. And I think that feedback loop causes those failures to happen early in the cycle rather than when you launch. And so for me in cartooning, I've definitely had cartoons that didn't resonate. I've definitely had cartoons that were provocative and resonated quite well with some groups and not well with other groups. And every time I get one of those, I try not to beat myself up about the cartoon that failed, but instead try to apply some of the lessons for sure. And sometimes it's quite positive if there's a polarizing cartoon that didn't do well with one group but did remarkably well with another. That's not such a bad thing, and you learn from that too. So I guess the big lesson for me overall in cartooning is that the cost of failure is so relatively low. And
Yeah.
again, you get measured over the length of a campaign rather than any one cartoon in particular. There are some businesses I'm working with where I create a cartoon a week for them. In some cases, for over 2.5 years, and you end up getting an arc of content that you increasingly fine tune it. That I'm at a point now where I have a much better pulse on what the readers like and what resonates well than I did at the very beginning. But you still have that variation, and you still want to push the edges and fringes because sometimes it's not a good step in the right direction, but sometimes it leads to a breakthrough you couldn't have anticipated.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, Tom. That's been absolutely fantastic and a real insight.